As the Diocese of Jefferson City prepares to receive a new shepherd for our local church, we should ask, what does the New Testament have to say about the qualities that make someone a good bishop? There are 3 passages that specifically name these kind of qualities. Let's begin with 1 Peter chapter 5. St. Peter shows beautiful humility here in calling himself a fellow presbyter, a fellow priest. He was the head of all the presbyters, all the apostles, and even of the 12, but he thought of himself as a fellow presbyter, a fellow elder or leader. Peter also describes himself as a witness to the sufferings of Christ and a sharer in the glory to be revealed. Bishops are never alone. They belong to a college of bishops, and they're the head of a whole council or presbyterate of priests. And St. Peter says that they must witness to the sufferings of Christ both by their preaching and by their living. The bishop must fill up in himself what is lacking in the suffering of Christ's body, the church. The bishop is called to suffer on behalf of his church. But Peter also says that suffering leads to glory. Tend the flock of God that is in your midst. This is what Jesus said to Peter on the shores of Galilee when he asked Peter 3 times if he loved him. Each time that Peter replied yes, Jesus said to feed his lambs and to tend his sheep. And Peter here is passing on to the bishop the same charge that Jesus laid on him. The way a bishop tends the flock well is by loving the Lord more than anyone or anything else. Peter then gives 2 commands. The bishop must take up his duties willingly, without seeking selfish gain or profit, and 2, he mustn't lord his position over anyone else. Jesus had said to the apostles that the pagans lord their authority over others, but it must not be that way with you. Christian leaders are to be humble servants and examples to the flock. Lastly, Peter reminds our new shepherd that Jesus himself is the chief shepherd. Bishops are only bishops insofar as they share in the one priesthood and in the one ministry of Christ. Just like Christ, they may suffer a crown of thorns in this life, but their fidelity will bring them an unfading crown of glory in heaven. The price of Christian ministry is steep, but the rewards are out of this world. The second passage for our consideration comes from the first letter of St. Paul to Timothy. There, Paul writes, "This saying is trustworthy. Whoever aspires to the office of bishop desires a noble task." Paul knows that it's not easy to be a bishop. The job is demanding and often thankless, and so he gives an encouragement that this calling is also noble. Service of the gospel is something to aspire to. Paul then provides a whole list of virtues for a bishop. There's a good reason why the church usually appoints a man to be a bishop only after many years of service, so that he can be tested by those years, learn from his mistakes, and grow in virtue. Irreproachable doesn't mean being without sin, but it does mean that the bishop should be known for good conduct, both inside and outside the church. Married only once is literally the husband of one wife. In the beginning of the church, there were hardly any middle-aged men who were not married, and in the first century, the church did ordain married men, but the church also put a number of restrictions on them. For example, if they were widowed, they should not have remarried. The idea seems to have been that just as Christ only has one bride, the church, so the bishop who represents Christ must have had only one bride himself. And today, the only bride a bishop is allowed is the local church herself. Just as Christ was celibate for his bride, so our bishop is celibate for the church. Next, St. Paul writes that the bishop should be temperate. This virtue would enable him to be clear-minded and so alert to the needs of his flock. He must be self-controlled and decent, meaning always respectful to to the dignity and the sovereignty of others. He is to be hospitable, meaning he should be willing to be inconvenienced for another's sake. He should be able to teach. One of the main responsibilities of the bishop is to be the chief teacher of the gospel. The next 5 qualities that St. Paul mentions are all negative except for the middle term. Not a drunkard, not aggressive, gentle, not contentious, and not a lover of money. In some ways, the negatives are summed up by that central positive virtue. If the bishop is gentle, then he won't be aggressive or contentious, and he'll be less inclined to abuse either alcohol or money. To be gentle doesn't mean being a pushover. It means being strong enough in his beliefs that he can be gentle in his manners, trusting that with the Lord, the battle's already won, and that God is the one who's really in charge. St. Paul then gives a striking analogy between domestic life and church life. If the bishop can manage his family, then he can manage the church. We often refer to the family as the domestic church, and that's the idea of St. Paul here too. If we prove ourselves trustworthy in small matters, then we can be trusted with greater ones. Finally, St. Paul warns that the zeal of a new convert can fade, or even worse, lead to pride, which is the devil's sin, and which led to his punishment, namely getting kicked out of heaven. Paul says that the bishop should have a good reputation with outsiders. The way a man treats strangers can be very illuminating, and Paul says that the bishop should be a man of integrity in treating all people well. Integrity avoids the devil's trap of disgrace. The third passage for our consideration comes from St. Paul's letter to Titus, where again he gives a list of virtues needed for a bishop. Some are similar to what we've already seen in 1 Timothy. And then Paul gives a lengthy list of virtues. I'll just point out some of the virtues that have not already been mentioned by 1 Timothy. The bishop must be a steward of God, who is a lover of goodness. He should always seek and support goodness wherever he finds it, throughout the diocese and in the people that he meets. The bishop must be just and holy. To be just is more than being fair. It's seeking what's right in God's eyes, who sees the heart and not the appearance. To be holy has the sense of belonging to God and not to this world. We don't need a worldly bishop. We need a holy bishop. Lastly, St. Paul says the bishop should hold fast to the true message as taught, so that he'll be able to exhort with sound doctrine and to refute opponents. The bishop must cling to the teaching of the church that comes to us from Christ Jesus and through the apostles. If he does this, he won't be blown about by the whimsies of the world, and he'll become a sure and a certain guide for us to find our way through the fog of this world to the eternal light of heaven. May the Lord bless and strengthen our new bishop in each of these virtues that St. Peter and St. Paul hold up as essential for sound leadership in the church. Ad multos annos, Bishop McKnight.